How would I describe the video I'm covering today?
Have you ever expected something to be bad, and then ended up disappointed anyway because it was just so much worse than you could have possibly imagined?
Yeah, that's how I'd describe it. We're going back to Mr. Enter today because he did a review of Sponge on the Run recently, and wow, is it bad? I'll be skipping the introduction and going straight into his actual points.
Somehow, paradoxically, this movie rehashes so much from previous SpongeBob episodes of movies, and at the same time, it completely misunderstands the SpongeBob universe. And me saying that right out of the gate is probably a red flag for a lot of people. I mean, how do you misunderstand the SpongeBob universe? It's a show that only rarely has continuity, and even a casual viewer could tell you about 20 times when one episode contradicted another. I mean, it's totally clear that the catalyst of this movie is that snails are endangered. You know, snails. SpongeBob's stand-in for cats. You know, we've had episodes about a race for snails,
which had 3 competitors, one of which was a rock. Also, you just called snails SpongeBob's stand-in for cats, and now you're talking about them engaging in races, which is more associated with dogs than cats. In fact, in that episode, Squidward uses terms like purebred to refer to his snail and mutt to refer to Gary.
Dream on, SpongeBob. I wouldn't let Snelly here play with that mongrel mutt. She's a purebred.
Which are both terms used in dog breeding. The SpongeBob Wiki also specifically notes that Gary has aspects of both real-world cats and dogs. This may seem irrelevant, but the actual classification of what each creature in SpongeBob is based off of is actually incredibly fluid, depending on what the writers want. I mean, John, let's not forget you acknowledged this little fact.
The only different thing about this episode is that the animal is based on a nudibranch. What the fuck is a nudibranch? Yeah, that's a perfect resemblance of Puffy Fluffy.
Speaking of which, the aforementioned A Pal for Gary could actually be used to prove that snails are rare in the SpongeBob universe, because if they weren't, why the hell wouldn't SpongeBob just get another snail as opposed to whatever the fuck Puffy Fluffy was? I mention this because, well, John's gonna talk a lot about the continuity of SpongeBob throughout this video, and although that is a little bit of a silly discussion, I'm at the very least willing to have it on the condition the other person is right when talking about said continuity. And John, as I'll expose at several points in this video, just isn't.
An episode about a pet show for snails.
Okay, first off, that was just a general pet show, not a show specifically for snails. Second off, your footage is of the wrong episode. The pet show happened in Grooming Gary, while this clip with Angry Jack is from Shell Shocked.
We have a pet food that is name-dropped within the movie for snails specifically. And the entire movie is built on the fact that snails are basically an endangered species. I don't know how you do this. I don't know how you watch the show and come up with the idea that these snails are probably hard to find.
Okay, let's talk about continuity for a second. Now, the late Stephen Hillenburg, you know, the guy who created SpongeBob SquarePants, said that the original movie is the end of the mythos, and that, essentially, the proper ending to the series sees SpongeBob becoming manager of the Krusty Krab 2. This would mean that everything SpongeBob related takes place before the events of the first movie, including the second and third movies. Furthermore, it's reasonable to assume that, considering this movie ended with all the snails King Poseidon had going to Bikini Bottom, that anything we see in the show that would imply snails are plentiful took place after this movie. You see, if you want to bring continuity into SpongeBob, that's fine, but you have to understand that it's not always going to be linear to what we see as the viewers. Or, to put it another way, you don't understand how continuity works.
You might think that I'm joking or looking too deeply into things, but no, I'm serious. The main plot of this movie is started when King Poseidon, who is in no way similar to King Neptune from the first movie, is so vain that he uses snail trail to moisturize himself. But because he does this so much, snails are noted to be, in the movie's words, depleted.
In fact, the entire snail population has been, what's the word? Oh, yeah, depleted.
So Plankton steals Gary the snail and gives him to the king. because there are no other snails anywhere in the world except in King Poseidon's dungeon and in SpongeBob's house. And King Poseidon puts all the snails in his dungeon after he's finished using them because snail labor is really the most efficient thing an absolute monarch can find.
Who said anything about it being efficient? I just assumed it was cheap.
The movie wants you to know right from the start that this really isn't SpongeBob, but a poor imitation of SpongeBob.
The temperate, pristine, shallow seas of the tropics.
That's not the French narrator.
A place of unparalleled beauty and fecundity.
You know, the one who's usually played by Tom Kenny, the voice actor who plays the main character of the movie, who is obviously available for a role that is usually done by the French narrator. It's the first thing in the movie, too.
Yeah, and the original movie opened with a bunch of pirates who must be SpongeBob fans given how excited they were to get tickets to the SpongeBob SquarePants movie, none of which were Patchy the Pirate, despite the fact that Patchy the Pirate is played by Tom Kenny. What I'm saying is, I really don't get your point here, John.
And here's the thing, I'm allowed to complain about all these little continuity errors and misunderstandings of SpongeBob because it's clear that the people behind the show are intimately familiar with the series. After all, the plot of this movie is exactly the same as the first movie. Plankton wants to get the Krabby Patty formula, because that is the only thing we can make a SpongeBob movie plot about apparently. So he has a plan that involves theft to get the Krusty Crew out of the way, by taking advantage of a king of the sea who is a merman. Said king's biggest flaw is his vanity. This one's biggest concern is wrinkles, but we do learn that he is...
Are you suggesting that I don't need this gorgeous mane of wavy locks?
You know how that's a clip from the first movie, right? And it works perfectly in context for the third movie.
Not really, no, given that King Poseidon's head was not shiny like King Neptune's was.
You know how that's a problem, right?
Actually, I don't, given that I agreed with a video you made earlier this year for your Unpopular Opinions Marathon, where you said,
being derivative and good is better than being original and bad. Originality is overrated, plain and simple.
This complaint is especially head-scratching given, I don't know if you know this, John, and by the way, this might surprise some of you, but the SpongeBob SquarePants movie was not a pinnacle of originality. It was actually primarily based off of the Odyssey, which, for those unaware, was a Greek story from around the 7th or 8th century BC, written by a guy named Homer. In fact, if one looks at the amount of things in the first SpongeBob movie that were blatantly references to things in the Odyssey, and compares that to the amount of things in Sponge on the Run that are blatantly references to other things in general, you're going to find the SpongeBob movie was less original in that regard.
This movie is technically a road trip movie, although to be fair on that one, every single movie based on a cartoon is also a road trip movie.
How the fuck was the Simpsons movie a road trip movie? Although they did go to Alaska, it wasn't to get something, I guess, outside of getting away from Springfield. And even then, the actual road trip part was a fairly minor part of the movie. To put it another way, calling it a road trip movie implies that getting to the destination of said road trip is the point of the movie. For example, in the first SpongeBob movie, the point was SpongeBob and Patrick needed to go to Shell City. The Simpsons movie is not about the Simpsons' journey to Alaska.
Patrick and SpongeBob must go on some long quest to get back a stolen, object. Along the way, they meet a celebrity guide that's there to be a random gag.
Okay, this one angers me because those two played very different roles in their respective films. David Hasselhoff essentially just came out of nowhere near the end of the movie. Meanwhile, not only is Keanu Reeves never named dropped, which I would already argue is a pretty big difference given the entire joke about David Hasselhoff's appearance in the first movie was just how what the fuck out of nowhere it was. But his character Sage is also a very constant presence throughout the film after his introduction. He serves as essentially a parody of a wise mentor, unlike Hasselhoff, who was just there because lol funny cameo.
Honestly though, I wouldn't mind that much if this movie was just The Search for Gary. What I hate the most about this setup is that it's the third movie that involves the secret formula going missing. The first time, I get it. It's the big movie, and that's the most common and famous SpongeBob plot. The second movie had a nice twist on it, so I can let that slide. But by the third time you make a movie about Plankton stealing the Krabby Patty formula, no, I want out. Do something new. Doing something new isn't out of SpongeBob's capabilities. A lot of people don't like the 22-minute specials, and I can understand that, but I do want to give them credit for this. Very few of them fall into this overcooked recipe. In them, SpongeBob was a cowboy. He went to some other city and became the mayor. There was a special about a train robbery.
Says he's sick of episodes about Plankton trying to steal the formula. Praises the episode The Great Patty Caper, which was about Plankton trying to steal the formula.
Even a lot of the 11 or 7-minute episodes have some interesting concepts that can be made bigger without having to go to the dry milk cow of, how does Plankton steal the formula today?
This video's gonna give me a fucking aneurysm, I swear. The last two clips John showed were from the episodes Spy Buddies and Someone's in the Kitchen with Sandy, respectively. Spy Buddies saw SpongeBob and Patrick spying on Plankton because he was trying to steal the formula. And not only was Someone's in the Kitchen with Sandy a plot about Plankton trying to steal the formula, but Enter reviewed it and criticized it for being unoriginal, despite now showing it in a list of episodes that he apparently thinks the movie should be more like since they were original.
The other half of this episode, it's a ripoff of Imitation Crabs. What is with that episode? In Season 7 alone, there are 3 episodes that directly rip off Imitation Crabs. Shellback Shenanigans, Grandma's Secret Recipe, and Someone's in the Kitchen with Sandy. I have no idea why. I mean, Imitation Crabs is a fine episode. It was decent, but I don't think it's like a tour de force or anything. It was a pretty good episode of SpongeBob. It's not something like Pancakes or Chocolate Nuts. Then I might understand them trying to rip it off 50 different. This movie is stale leftovers that should have been incinerated as soon as it was found. And that goes for the jokes, too. Skill Crane jokes. How original.
Self-driving boat.
And you use that joke in your episode about the self-driving car.
John, how are either of those even jokes? The first one was just Plankton using something that kind of operated like a skill crane, and the other was Patrick saying self-driving boat. What's the joke there?
King Neptune, Poseidon, I don't give a fuck, offers a boon for giving a snail to him. This is never mentioned afterwards and not something Plankton ever takes. He gets absolutely no reward for giving SpongeBob's snail to the king.
Okay, first off, the boon was never mentioned again because that wasn't what Plankton was after. He was just trying to get SpongeBob out of the way, like you acknowledged earlier in this video. And by the way, that was his reward. That was his motivation. It was said at the beginning of the movie by Karen that the entire reason all his plans fail is because of SpongeBob. So he tries to get SpongeBob out of the way so he can successfully execute one of his plans. Did you and I watch the same movie?
Then there's the big stuff that's wrong with this movie. The characters just aren't right.
Feels more to me like the journey of a singular hero who, against all odds, triumphs over adversity.
Does this sound like SpongeBob? From anywhere?
Yes. SpongeBob's always had a bit of an egotistical side. You keep talking about the first movie. Remember how he just assumed he was going to be the manager of Krusty Krab 2 without any real reason to?
Then he goes on to have a fight with Patrick that lasts literally a minute and goes nowhere. I only think that this is here because it's a law that the two best friend characters must have a fight that gets resolved quickly in every kid's movie ever.
Yeah, that's explicitly what they're satirizing. Before that fight occurs, Patrick even says,
We're two dudes setting out with a common goal. We'll argue about something dumb, fight and break up, only to come back together when we realize neither could do it without the other.
Plankton, however, is even worse. In the first movie, he completely took over and there was a lot of chaos. In this movie, Plankton just gives up. We never even see him selling Krabby Patties. He just gets the formula because Krabs gives it to him because he can't be bothered to look for SpongeBob. And then, randomly, Plankton has a change of heart, comes back, and says that he stole Gary to get SpongeBob out of the way.
Again, it was explicitly said in the movie that Plankton didn't accept this victory because of how easy it was.
Wait, you're giving up?
Oh, Plankton, I wouldn't expect you to understand. But somehow, without SpongeBob, this whole thing just doesn't make sense anymore.
You can't do that. I've spent my entire career waiting for this moment, and you roll over like a harpoon whale? I won't let you rob me of my vengeance!
It's like no one in this movie has any motivation for any single thing that they do. Sure, SpongeBob had a reason to go to Shell City, I mean Atlantic City, but riddle me this. Why didn't he tell Krabs where he was going? Why didn't he at least tell Squidward, someone he sees as a friend? SpongeBob just decides to pick up and leave.
It slipped his mind in the moment. It happens sometimes, even in the real world. I don't know what to tell you.
This is where they meet Keanu Reeves, who is the tumbleweed, and he gives them a coin to help them defeat Machete, who is a devil with laser eyes that melts in the sunlight like a vampire, which is not something that devils do.
As I would know, I'm personally friends with 6 devils, none of whom melt in the sunlight. Anyway, that's all I'm going to cover because I actually agree with the Camp Coral stuff, so final thoughts. This review was not devoid of good points or anything, but the bad points were really bad, and it honestly felt like John didn't even watch or at least understand the movie. And when said movie is Sponge on the Run, that's just kind of sad. Good night, and good luck.